Well, thank you, Jan, and I would like also to thank the MDRN team for this terrific conference. As you said, I'm going to talk about the way Paulhan reads Bergson, and I've slightly changed the title of my paper into Terrorist Bergson or Duration Subverted. I mean, it doesn't change the content of what I'm going to say. It's just a title more close to what I'm going to say. So I guess the starting point of my reflection was as follows. I wanted to know the extent to which Henry Bergson's philosophy of time helped shaping the profile and understanding of the history of literature during the early 20th century. As you know, Henry Bergson deeply renewed the understanding of temporality through his concept of duration as developed for the first time in his 1889 book Time and Free Will, l'essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience, and consequently rediscovered in every single book, and specifically in his 1907 Creative Evolution, L'évolution créatrice. And of course it was tempting for me to look for ways in which this concept of a continuous, uninterrupted, irreversible creative duration possibly influenced the understanding of how literary works succeed each other in a given period, and also possibly enabled an idea of literature as a unified and organic movement. To be more precise, I wanted to know if Bergson's idea of time, as embodied in both concepts of duration on the one hand for time and free will, and evolution for creative evolution, of course, participated in the formulation of the progressivism that runs through a major part of the critical essays from the time, or even enabled the idea of an avant-garde as a progressive temporality within literature. But of course, the essay I would like to base my reflection upon today completely reverses this positive connection I was fantasizing between time in general and the internal history of literature. In 1936, and again in 1941, Jean Paulhan, who has been the director of the Nouvelle Revue Française since 1925, as well as the director of two mainly avant-garde oriented journals called Commerce and Mesure, gives the formulation of what he understands as la terreur dans les lettres, or terror in literature. A phenomenon and intimate tendency of literature which makes the hardcore of his book Les Fleurs de Table. And I'm going to be, using for my presentation Michael Sirutinsky's translation of the 1941 Flowers of Table, which was published in 2006 at the University of Illinois Press. So of this terror, Jean Paulhan gives a symptomatology rather than a mere depiction. Since the beginning of the 19th century, he says, French literature founds its own possibility on the rejection of any kind of immediate formal perfection, on the ban of any kind of immediate enjoyment and self-enjoyment during creation. Language, it seems, and all forms of aesthetic legacy should be carefully kept under surveillance, or as Jean Paulhan has it, the literary arts are these days marked by refusal, or in French, nos arts littéraires sont faits de refus. Which is to say that has arisen in a writer's creative consciousness a doubt about established forms of language, about words, of course, and among words, about clichés and commonplace expressions. How can one be sure that these clichés, since they only can be repeated, since they already have a past, will not betray our thoughts? Terror is the name for this loss of an immediacy that leads every person dealing with language to suspect language. Language constantly threatens to replace active thought by the mechanical juxtaposition of pre-thought or end-thought entities. Hence, the only escape, which is the constant renewal of language, the frantic search for the yet unsaid thing or the yet unpronounced word. But by so rejecting the past and the past forms and achievements of language, by giving way to terror, literature loses its vitality. And I'm quoting Paulhan again. There is something humiliating about seeing words that have long charmed us being withdrawn without getting anything back in return, and things along with words, because stones really are precious sometimes, just as fingers are sometimes delicate. We only wanted to break free from a language that was too conventional, and now we are close to breaking free from all human language. I'm just going to read this one in French, and then I'm only going to quote in English. Il est humiliant de se voir retirer sans rien obtenir en échange des mots qui nous ont longtemps enchantés et les choses avec les mots, car il arrive enfin que les pierres soient précieuses et les doigts délicats. L'on ne voulait rompre qu'avec un langage trop convenu, et voici que l'on est prêt de rompre avec tout le langage humain. After the symptoms, thus, comes the diagnosis. Terror, Pollan says, originates itself in a very specific form of hatred pointed at language, or, as he calls it, misology. Misology, like M-I-S-O-L-O-G-Y. But with the diagnosis comes also Bergson, and the reason of my focusing on Flowers of Time. Bergson, according to Pollan, is the first philosopher to give the theoretical justification for misology, for the suspicion towards language. Our Inner Life says Pollan, quoting Bergson, or rephrasing Bergson, if we have to believe Bergson, cannot be expressed without leaving behind everything that is most precious about it. Our mind is at every point oppressed by a language, and every man, if he wants to get to his authentic thought, must eventually break through a crust of words that very quickly hardens again, and of which commonplace expressions, cliches, and conventions are merely the most obvious forms. And Bergson, indeed, in a key moment of time and free will, formulates the essential incompatibility that exists between language and the form of our consciousness. Consciousness, he says, is ever-changing and merely qualitative. Consciousness is the continuous succession of moments which belong to one another. As such, any attempt to analyze and fragment it will necessarily deform it and measure it to a unit that it cannot accept. Consciousness is immeasurable, and language cannot force it into its own articulation of reality. Consciousness is mainly duration. And language is not duration but space, and seeks space where there is time, and identity where there is only change. So my problem is solved, it seems. It is indeed Bergson who legitimates misology by declaring language incompatible with its own concept of duration. Bergson is guilty of comforting the idea that there could be something as a power of words, un pouvoir des mots, and as such he deserves the title of terrorist-in-chief. He is the terrorist-in-chief. Bergson is the father of every single avant-garde. And in that sense, Pollan's philosophical effort is entirely dedicated to the deconstructing of such a pouvoir des mots, which he says is nothing but a myth. I'm quoting again Pollan. I hardly know of any other doctrine that is, on the face of it, more alien and more hostile to literature, or more reliable to reduce it to a pile of quivering and neglected words. Problem solved, but the debate over the existence of such a thing as a pouvoir des mots takes a whole new dimension if one pays attention to a very specific sub-discourse in Pollan's text, which is, of course, a discourse about time and about literature as a whole, as a collection, about literature being a temporality in its own. It is of little doubt that Pollan in Flowers of Tarbes targets the outbreak of the more or less successive avant-garde during the first half of the century. Most of the features he attributes to terrorism, what he calls terrorism, implicitly designate the historical avant-gardes that Pollan was in close contact with as the director of both the NRF, Mesure, and Commerce. These features are primitivism, non-conformism, exploration of the unconscious, automatic writing. And Pollan is hence both pointing out very specific literary practices and rewriting them all through a very synthetic theoretical gesture. Beyond the historical les avant-gardes, there is such a thing as l'avant-garde in general. And it is precisely the shape of this avant-garde in general that is striking to me. Terror by itself is, as we said, a rejection of all established forms of language. Literature as a history, or the history of literature, is hence determined and driven by the necessary negation and forgetting of the past, and the compulsory, the mandatory search for novelty, quote, unquote. For terror is above all dependent upon language in a general sense, in that it condemns a writer to say only what a certain state of language leaves him free to express. He is restricted to those areas of feeling and thought where language has not yet been overused. From one single avant-garde to the next, from one novel or poem to the next, there cannot be but this break between past and present imposed by the ban of any kind of repetition. There is such a thing as a progress in literature, says Pollan, but literature only progresses by abandoning the territories it once explored. Pollan sketches here a fundamentally negative temporality, which progresses only under constraint, and which hollows itself out in this very progress. Creation is haunted by the negative memory of past works and words. And I'm quoting, "It seems then as if literature were bearing down with all its weight on each new writer, compelling and constricting him so that he is only able to remain a man at the cost of an infinite flight." But Pollan once again makes Bergson responsible for this temporality, which is nothing but the exact contrary of what Bergson precisely understands as time or duration. Bergson's concept of duration imposes the idea of a both highly continuous and highly creative reality. Its different moments belong to each other and are separated by no break. The past, inserts itself into the future with all its momentum, as well as memory does into action. Duration is unpredictable and indefinitely growing. And Bergson precisely marks a renewal, as you know, in philosophy, by giving back to time a positivity, and by giving us back a possibility to understand liberty. So the highly problematic and polemic dimension of Pollan's critical construction becomes here obvious. Pollan makes Bergson the origin not only of a specific relationship to language, but also of a specific temporality, which appears to be the exact reversal of Bergson's own idea of time. Hence my hypothesis that Flowers of Tarbes is partly at least built on a philosophical confrontation with Bergson, and that the main stake of this confrontation is, of course, an idea of time, and that behind Pollan's discourse on language, we readers have to read a discourse on time. Of course, it would take pages to analyze more accurately the terms in which Pollan confronts Bergson's philosophy of language or even deforms it. I would like to go here straight to what seems to be the heart of the problem. So, Pollan says that the power of words, the pouvoir des mots, is a myth. And at the heart of the myth lies a mechanism of which he gives a pretty accurate phenomenological account. Terror, he says, is an answer to the common fear that the form of language might prevail over its meaning, that I could be seduced by the appealing form of my language, that my thinking could be haunted by some unthought within language. Clichés and commonplace expressions should be forbidden because they are uncertain and can be read in turns as mere language or pure thought. How can I be sure that the author whose text I'm reading did not make himself a victim of his own words? And Pollan answers, this fear originates in a fundamental confusion between the reader's attitude towards language and the writer's attitude towards language. It is a mistake to believe that my discomfort towards language has an equivalent in the writer's writing mind. I am likely to think the writer as imprisoned in his clichés, because by reading myself the cliché, I cannot decide its value, word or thought. And actually, Pollan dedicates a whole chapter on this mechanism, which he calls projection. And I'm quoting here, the reader locates this extreme presence and concern about words at the origin of a sentence or an offending passage, whereas in reality it occurs for him at the end of his effort. Thus, the eyes of his mind, like the eyes of his body, naturally saw objects upside down, in the space for one, and in time for the other. Projection itself comes from nothing but a misunderstanding about time. And the misunderstanding is even twofold. First, it reverses the chronology of communication and analyzes the act of writing on the basis on the inner physiology of the act of reading. Second, it reverses the inner dynamic of language and forgets that it is the idea that informs the words and not the words that produce the idea. Whoever believes in something like a power of words, un pouvoir des mots, is mistaken about the intimate process of creation. Writer and reader are confused as well as past and present. The power of words is a myth generated by our failure at recognizing the autonomy of creation, as well as the phenomenological difference between writing and reading. From this confused perception of temporality stems the specific dynamic of the avant-garde. Not only is it constantly looking backwards, as I already said, the avant-garde is essentially obsessed by the origin and history of each sentence spoken, trying to revisit every single act of language so as to determine its authenticity. In other words, any avant-garde literature is doomed to be late, far from being in advance on anything. And being late on language, the only possibility left to catch up on it and find again a possibility for creation is the systematic, unselective, unmethodical, radical destruction of ambiguity, which is terror, of course. The terrorist ban on clichés and commonplace expressions, by which the avant-garde adds to its fundamental being always late, a non less fundamental going too fast. Too late and too fast. Paulhan redefines Bergson's philosophy of time into a kind of passive-aggressive philosophy of speed, which is interesting in itself, but also locates literature's only salvation in slowness. So, looking back, the starting point of my reflection was the highly paradoxical configuration in which Paulhan implicitly made Bergson responsible for the avant-garde as a negative temporality, obsessed not so much with the future, but with the past, entirely absorbed not into creation, but into reaction. I eventually suggested to read Flowers of Tarbes as formulating an insufficiency within Bergson's philosophy, namely the relationship between time and language, as if Bergson had been unable to extend his own philosophical effort to language. The positivity and creativity of duration, Paulhan says, are destined to be reversed into a negative and divided temporality by the mere obstacle of language. There is something about time and language that Bergson left unthought, and which is precisely their interference. Bergson fails at understanding the intimate temporality of writing, and by so doing, he threatens literature in its own succession, and maybe even time in general. Any philosophy of time, positive as it may be, will simply revert into an obsession with the past, and into a mere escaping forward, if it is not taken up to the point where it can think the specificity of language during the act of writing. I would say the first way in which Flowers of Tarbes contributes to our reflection on time and temporality lies in the way it interfaces time with language, of course. Our idea of time determines our relationship to language, as shows, for instance, Bergson's philosophy. But in return, one's relationship to time, reveals Paulhan, be it the time of literature or time in general, is deeply influenced by one's relationship to language. Language also is a place where our perception of time elaborates itself. And eventually, the avant-garde is not even so much defined by its turning the history of literature into a merely negative temporality, as by its specific relationship to the time of writing. Through the case of the avant-garde, Paulhan makes visible the secret connection that exists between our intimate times in general and time, the philosophical time, as it emerges from our actions. But of course, one should not forget to analyze Flowers of Tarbes as part of his strategy in a given field and a given moment. In this respect, Paulhan's text is maybe not so much interesting because of what he says about Bergson's influence on the avant-garde, but because of the way he establishes and justifies this influence. And I would like to make here only one suggestion, that by defining the avant-garde as intrinsically determined by a Bergsonian conception of time and language, Paulhan moves a movement like surrealism, for instance, back to a philosophical paradigm it decided to ignore and even despised. By moving surrealism away from his Hegelian inspiration towards a more Bergsonian one, he simultaneously evacuates Bergson and the avant-garde, or evacuates the avant-garde through Bergson by rereading the Bergsonian temporality as a myth. To a large extent, hence, Paulhan's approach in Flowers of Tarbes can be said to be a conservative one. His philosophy of language entails a return to rhetoric and a further institutionalization of language. But this philosophy of language is also a philosophy of time. And most of Paulhan's effort, as we have seen, aims at slowing down literature and slowing down time, which is, of course, far from being unproblematic. But such is the complexity of Flowers of Tarbes that it would be a mistake to hope for a unified and stabilized conclusion. And I would like to preserve the intimate dynamic of the text and listen carefully to Paulhan when he defined his own duty as a critique. For a long time now, we have accepted that there is a kind of precautionary, creative, in a word, rhetorical criticism, which sees its role as paving the way for plays or poems, guiding them, creating favorable conditions for them. L'on a longtemps admis qu'il existait une critique préventive, créatrice, d'un mot rhétoricienne, propre à frayer les voies aux drames et aux poèmes, à les guider, à leur offrir un milieu favorable. Une critique Préventive, he says. And later on in the book, he says rhetoric is necessary pour fixer par avance, to determine in advance the possibility and destiny of literature. How could we not hear in Pollan's words, how could we not hear behind this avance he claims to be his duty, the secret and persistent longing for something like an avant-garde? Belonging to the avant-garde is not the poet's concern anymore, but the critic's. And I would like to conclude my reflection here on this new paradox, which is the very reappearance of a fantasized and desired avant-garde position at the very heart of a discourse that precisely claims to bring any avant-garde to an end. Thank you.